Hey everybody, welcome back. Let's jump back into these theses of Kant's and let's see what we can get out of them. So we're going to start with the third thesis on page 31. He writes, nature has willed that man, entirely by himself, produce everything that goes beyond the mechanical organization of his animal existence and partake in no other happiness or perfection than what he himself, independently of instinct, can secure through his own reason. Um, that basically we have the capacity and the ability to create our own tools. I mean, broadly construed, that the power of reason, which can operate through us and ultimately does, allows us to come up with theories, to come up with techniques, ways of organization, to create, literal tools, things not merely abstract, and then, things that can become societal institutions that it is sort of, in that sense, the power lies within us collectively, to do this. He goes on um, to say nature does nothing unnecessary, bold claim, and is not prodigal in the use of means to her ends, since she gave man reason and the freedom of will based on it, reason and then freedom of will based on it. This is a clear indication of her objective as regards his makeup. Specifically, he should not be led by instinct, or at least definitely not alone, nor be provided for and instructed by ready-made knowledge. Instead, he should produce everything for himself. Um, you know, my sense of kind of what's going on there is that there is, when I think he means ready-made knowledge, I mean maybe that's some of the stuff that's sort of built into us when we already come about, but it might also mean um, the various things that have already sort of been put in place. And so that part of this progressive, evolving journey means that we're each and every generation is sort of tasked with the production and the creation of its own tools for emancipation, for more enlightenment, to to, to to occupy and possess what it is that we've been given to occupy and possess. Um, yeah, so this means we don't just retreat to instincts, and we don't just merely sort of go on autopilot and assume that all of the sort of um, mechanical, and that doesn't really mean necessarily the way that we think that, but in terms of like the given operations for the way things seem to be going, like the machinery of nature, the machinery of the human being and human society, that we sort of are supposed to and will continue to produce new tools, produce new knowledge, to get to where it is that we're supposed to be going. Um, yeah, and there's more that can be said about that, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. He does talk about you know, preparing the way, which we already kind of referenced, previously. As sort of there's a setup and delivery, and then setup and delivery, and it just sort of keeps going in that way. Um, so let's go to the fourth thesis at the bottom of page 31. He writes, the means that nature uses to bring about the development of all of man's capacities is the antagonism among them in society. As far as um, in the end, this antagonism is the cause of law-governed order in society. I mean, this is the big one because this is sort of like a, why do we fight? Why are we in conflict with one another? And what Kant is saying is this is the way that nature brings things about. Um, that within society, we're gonna argue, we're gonna fight. It's also going to take place between societies. But this isn't to be understood as without purpose. That the antagonism has a purpose, and it's to produce certain ends. That it's an agonistic struggle to bring forward the things that we're capable of bringing forward. He says, in this context, I understand antagonism to mean men's unsocial sociability. Unsocial sociability. Um, Drop down, he says, I'm on page 32. This capacity for social existence is clearly embedded in human nature, right? So, claim about human nature that we're number one, we're social, right? But also that part of being social means that we're going to be in conflict with other people. Um, Man has a propensity for living in society, for in that state he feels himself to be more than man, feels himself to be more than the development of his natural capacities. It helps it helps reveal our purpose. This connection with others and living with others. This is that we aren't meant to sort of be out there, lone individuals. I think that Kant, like an Enlightenment thinker, has high aspirations for the individual, but that the community life, the social life is something that um, comes first, and it also sort of grounds the individual in something, and a connection, and clearly it's also going to be antagonistic again to bring about these rational ends, this cosmopolitan intent. He says he also has, however, a great tendency to isolate himself, where he finds in himself the unsociable characteristic of wanting everything to go according to his own desires, and he therefore anticipates resistance everywhere, just as he knows about himself that for his part he tends to resist others. Now, this resistance awakens all of man's powers, brings him to overcome his tendency towards laziness, and drives him driven by his desires for honor, power, property, secure status among his fellows, whom he neither suffers nor withdraws from. Um, and he goes on to say, all of men's talents are gradually developed, his taste is cultured, and through progressive enlightenment, he begins to establish a way of thinking that can, in time, transform the crude natural capacity for moral discrimination into definite practical principles, and thus transform a pathologically enforced agreement into a society, and finally into a moral whole. And we'll talk about that more in a second. He's sort of explaining why it is that we are necessarily antagonistic. We want to be with other people, but at the same time, we have these drives and desires, these sort of instinctual impulses, um, proclivities to sort of be our own person and to assert what it is that we want on the world. And if you're hearing some Nietzsche or something else in there, you probably should. That he's recognizing that we are a contentious lot, because we are often at odds about what it is that we want, and if someone wants the same thing, and there's not enough of it, or if what they want somehow is contending with what we want in some way. And then we also want the esteem of our of others. We want the honor. We want that we desire power to actualize, um, to realize our desires, to actualize our projects, and that it just seems that this is necessarily going to create conflict, and that you know we can either think of this as happening for no good reason, or as happening for a good reason, and not just a good reason in terms of you know explaining why it happens, but it's a good reason in terms of what it is that it's going to bring about. And if you drop down, he says, um, thus, thanks be to nature for the incompatibility, for the distasteful competitive vanity, for the insatiable desire to possess and also to rule. He says, without them, all of humanity's excellent natural capacities would have lain eternally dormant. So, like, conflict brings it out. It brings out like what is potentially most potent and powerful, and um, And not only is it going to do that, it's going to get more refined. It's not going to be as barbaric. Um, man's man wills concord. Uh, Man wills concord, but nature better knows what is good for the species. She wills discord. Maybe we want peace, even though he's set up like the how it is that these conflicts come into being. Maybe we want peace, maybe we don't want the conflict, but nature knows better, and so drives the conflict anyways. Like perhaps working through the instincts, perhaps working through the natural conditions, perhaps working through how it is that we operate on the large scale, so sociologically, politically. He says he wills to live comfortably and pleasantly, but nature wills that he should be plunged from laziness and inactive comfort into work and hardship, so that he will in turn seek by his own cleverness to pull himself up from them. That sense of building the tools and the techniques and everything else that human beings construct and create. The natural impulse to do this, the sources of unsociability and thoroughgoing resistance that give rise to so much evil, but also drive men anew toward further exertions of their powers, consequently to diverse development of their natural capacities, indicates the design of a wise creator, if you can note what he's signaling there. Not the hand of a malicious spirit who fiddled with the creator's masterful arrangements or enviously spoiled it. I mean, so this is kind of like saying, if we view nature driving us into conflict, and that is ultimately bringing out what's best, this isn't really evil. It's good. It's providential. This is perhaps we could view this as the work of God working through rational principle, universal laws, the grand tendencies, not isolated and viewed negatively, but again, within the context of this large drama that's taking place, that these are beneficial developments and processes, as painful and disturbing as they might be. Fifth thesis on page 33, the greatest problem for the human species, whose solution nature compels it to seek, is to achieve a universal civil society administered in accord with the right. Meaning something like, how do we get a universal civil society? How does that going to come about given the things that that we've said? Since it's only in society, and indeed only in one that combines the greatest freedom and thus a thoroughgoing antagonism among its members. So if we want freedom, we're going to have antagonism. With a precise determination and protection of the boundaries of this freedom, so that it can coexist with the freedom of others, since it is only in such a society. I mean, we want a society that has freedom for everyone, but also has boundaries that seem to work in such a way as that we're not infringing upon each other's freedoms. I mean, I mean, in some ways he's right. Like, I mean, this is still the question, right? Like, how do we live in a society where we can do what it is that we believe or think is like the right thing to do, but this doesn't have like negative consequences of others, or at least not ones that are helping to facilitate this evolution and getting towards where it is that it seems that we want to go, or that nature wants us to go. He dropped down a couple lines. He says, thus must there be a society in which one will find the highest possible degree of freedom under external laws, combined with irresistible power, a perfectly rightful civil constitution. And then if you look at the last couple lines of that, he says, all the culture and art that adorn mankind, as well as the most beautiful social order, are fruits of unsociableness that is forced to discipline itself, and thus through an imposed art to develop nature's seed completely. I wanted to pay attention to that in particular because he mentioned like external laws, or at least outside of the thing itself, and he brings in sort of like art as an example of this. So think about the free play of the imagination. Like, you can sort of imagine anything that you want. You can pick up a guitar and just like play the strings. That you can there's like a chaotic and if you will, erotic, a sort of unbounded emergence of just sort of like pure freedom, pure creativity, right? But how does it really become beautiful, right? This is the imposition of order, the imposition, the imposing of laws or principles upon, the otherwise chaotic. And so he's saying that we need to have laws, and this is going to enter into like the idea of like, a morality that has to be like sort of grafted into this thing, that it's like a law of regarding, how we're going to conduct ourselves, or sort of evolve, like restrict and evolve and refine our nature, um, that we can look to what we do with art. We bound it and constrict it, but in the fashioning of something beautiful. And so you try to get this perfect marriage of freedom and restriction, so that that there's a painting that's on the wall and it can, like, it can really wow us, or music that is, in accord with some type of musical philosophy, musical principles, that it does particular things. And if you can find that way to go between freedom and order, that's the magic. That's what you really want. Okay, sixth thesis. This problem is both the hardest and the last to be solved by the human species. The difficulty that the mere idea of this task places before us is this: man is an animal that, if he lives among other members of his species, he needs a master. I mean, this is like the not so fun part. We need someone, something to basically act as that which imposes the things that we don't want. But again, it's to get what it is that we do want. We want the beauty. We want the justice. We want to be able to act in freedom, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't destroy us, that isn't chaotic, right? For he certainly abuses his freedom in relation to his equals, and although as a rational creature he desires a law that establishes boundaries for everyone's freedom, his selfish animal propensities induce him to accept himself from them wherever he can, right? Like we're always like special. We, like, the rules don't apply to us. He thus requires a master who will break his self-will and force him to obey a universally valid will whereby everyone can be free. I mean, yeah, like we don't want this, but we need it. We need rationally imposed order, right? We need some sort of master. What that looks like politically, I think that we could debate it. We talked a little bit about it in the last video, but let me just press on here, page 34. He says, well, actually, the very, very bottom of 33, then the top of 34. Thus, begin wherever he will, it is not to be seen how he can obtain a guarantor of public justice, who will himself be just, whether he seek it in a single person or in a group of several selected for the role. So you get maybe some different possibilities politically there. For each of them will abuse his freedom if he has no one above him to apply force in accord with laws. The supreme guarantor should be just in himself and still be a man. This is therefore the hardest task of all. Indeed, its perfect solution is impossible. From such warped wood as is man-made, nothing straight can be fashioned. Nature only enjoins us to the approximation of this idea. That it is also the last task to be solved also follows from this. It requires the correct concept of the nature of a possible constitution, great experience during much of the world's course, and above all else, a good will prepared to accept that constitution. But it's hard to find. Three factors such as these together all at once. When it happens, it will only be very late and after many futile attempts. I mean, so, what I'm hearing here is that there's not going to be a perfect solution to this. It's only going to be approximate. It's going to be flawed in some way. But he also seems to be suggesting that ultimately, the guarantor, the one who does it, is still ultimately, I think, man. And I'm not entirely sure to what degree we have to think about this in terms of an enlightened prince or a philosopher king or like a the sovereign. Um, um, but it definitely is something that is going to be to lie within within us, right? A power that we allow for, that we endow, that we sort of we allow the law or justice to be something that rests with us but outside of us at the same time and can be imposed upon us via a socio-political structure or institution. And and I'm open to being wrong about that, but it definitely seems like that the main thing is that this isn't something that we can basically trust ourselves with, but it's something that, and I mean, individuals definitely, but that the species needs is a locus um, to act as the one or the ones that make determinations for us, because we're always going to be sort of preoccupied or biased according to our own desire to want to be free. And so we need law, and that law sort of has to be able to be um, enacted and dispensed by another. So, I mean, hopefully that's at least enough, right, to get the sense of what he's trying to get at here. Um, so let's look at the seventh thesis. The problem of establishing a perfect civil constitution depends on the problem of law-governed external relations among nations and cannot be solved unless the latter is. Um, and so we're really getting at interstate conflicts and the problem of war. I mean, this is obviously not only are we going to be at odds with one another with competing desires, but now it becomes sort of magnified by the fact that you've got large groups of people living together, and now they have competing, um, you know, interests, and that conflict is one thing. War is an entirely other thing. So, if you will, drop down a little bit. He says nature has thus once more used human quarrelsomeness, men's inevitable antagonism, even in the large societies and political bodies that are created through it, as a means for discovering a state of calm and security, that is, through wars, through excessive and never remitting preparation for war, through the resultant distress that every nation must, even during times of peace, feel within itself. They're driven to make some initial imperfect attempts. Finally, after much devastation, upheaval, and even complete exhaustion of their inner powers, they are driven to take the step that reason could have suggested, even without so much sad experience, namely to leave the lawless state of savagery and enter into a federation of peoples. What is that, like a United Nations? That the sad truth is that we could have seen this, we could have done this at any earlier time, but one of the things that he's sort of saying is going to happen, and in some degree it has happened, to what extent it's fully realized. I mean, I think that's highly dubious, but um, highly doubtful, and long way to go. But that he's recognizing that at some point some sort of federation needs to come into being to start to moderate these intergroup, international, um, disagreements, so that what reason has always provided us a means of doing can now actually sort of start to be facilitated. Because remember, we have to sort of externalize the authority and locate it in particular sort of bodies of power, right? Um, what's he say here? In such a league, every nation, even the smallest, can expect to have security and rights, not by virtue of its own might or its own declarations regarding what is right, but from this great federation of people. So they come together to, sort of enact, laws and various projects which try to give everybody the peace that they want. It doesn't matter the relative strength or importance of any given nation. Everybody sort of is sort of represented and tended to. On page 35, he dropped down a few lines. He says, all wars are accordingly so much attempts, though not as man's intention, but as nature's objective to bring about new relations among nations. I mean, kind of again, going back to the point that all of it sort of has a reason, and all of it is sort of an attempt to manifest the powers and interests of people on the individual scale, right, and then of nations and the larger collective scale. He says, so this is a way to view these conflicts, to view these revolutions that take place. Again, even if we're not fully aware of these larger evolutionary rational reasons for all of this to take place. And then he says in the next paragraph on page 35, he's bringing up these various questions about what it all means and what it's all about. Does it mean anything? Does it mean nothing? He says at the bottom of the page, he says, these three questions come roughly to this. Is it truly rational to assume that nature is purposive or purposive in its parts, but purposeless as a whole, that the lawless state did to savage, what the lawless state did to savages, namely hold back all of our species' natural capacities until the evil that this placed them under compelled them to leave this state and enter into a civil constitution in which all those seeds can be developed. Barbarous freedom will also do to already established nations, to wit, by expending all of the Commonwealth's powers on arming itself against others, by the devastation caused by war, and still more by maintaining themselves in constant readiness for war, they hamper progress towards full development of man's natural capacities. I mean, clearly some of this is problematic. I think it's clear anyways. A sort of justification for colonialism and a sort of the way that we might come to view cultivated, rational societies that are sort of further along the evolutionary, their evolutionary development, and those that aren't, they're more barbarous, that, harken back to, the olden days when people weren't as enlightened. And so aggression towards them, while terrible, at the same time forces them to sort of get organized and to sort of, evolve their political apparatus and all of that stuff. And I just don't know. I mean, on the one hand, it totally makes sense what he's saying, but I think that there's definitely some racial aspect to his thinking, some cultural bias to his to what he's saying here that we should probably at least point out. Nevertheless, the point that he's making is that even the wars between states seem to serve this grander purpose and bringing people into a league of nations, a federation of peoples. That all this is sort of working towards this more peaceful, more freedom, to these ends. Which again, this is what nature wants. This is what reason is sort of helping us to do. The eighth thesis, on page 36, he says, one cannot regard the history of the human species in the large as the realization of a hidden plan of nature to bring about an internally and for this purpose. Let me start over. One can regard the history of the human species in the large as the realization of a hidden plan of nature to bring about an internally and for this purpose also an extremely perfect national constitution as the sole state in which all of humanity's natural capacities can be developed. I think that kind of makes more sense now that we can go back and we can view history and everything that's happening as part of this sort of drama, part of a narrative of events that's bringing us all together into more unified association and the ability to identify and to govern our behavior and to see more moral, intellectually refined, nature sort of be shaped and molded by these developments. On page 37, At the middle of the page, he says, if one hinders the citizen from pursuing his well-being in whatever way consistent with the freedom of others he chooses, one hampers the liveliness of enterprise generally and, along with it, the power of the whole. Therefore, restrictions on personal activities will be increasingly abolished and general freedom of religion will be granted. Enlightenment will thus gradually rise, though folly and caprice will sometimes slip in. I mean, you can't help it. It arises as a great good that must save the human race from even the self-seeking expansionary schemes of their rulers. If the latter just understand what is to their own advantage. And so this again, the gradual ascendancy, you know, how much less sense in time wars and conflicts will make because we are going to be more enlightened. We're going to have more freedom. We're not going to need as many externalized boundaries placed upon us and laws placed upon us that we will slowly get to the place where we're able to take more and more responsibility. We won't be perfect, but that this is going towards like that enlightenment that that he talked about in the last piece. Page 38. He writes, last few lines, nature's supreme objective, a universal cosmopolitan state, the womb in which all of the human species' original capacities will be developed, will at last come to be realized, right? So we'll finally have, this universal cosmopolitan state, the universal city in which all humans are, can participate as full and free, rational citizens. Ninth thesis, a philosophical attempt to work out a universal history of the world in accord with the plan of nature that aims at a perfect civic union of the human species must be regarded as possible and even as helpful to this objective of nature's. I mean, he's really here talking about doing philosophy and have a philosophical approach to history, and in which, that the narrative that we are giving is in part sort of helping to facilitate, these future endeavors. That we have to sort of slowly understand it in a way that helps. Or when I say have to, it seems by what he's saying that that's just gonna happen. So the sooner that we kind of get on board, the better. If you look over on page 39. He says, bottom of that top paragraph, for what use is it to laud and recommend observing the majesty and wisdom of creation in the non-rational realm of nature, if that part of the great theater of supreme wisdom that contains the purpose of all the rest, the history of the human race, the whole human race, should remain an endless reproach to it, the sight of which compels us against our wills to turn our eyes away from it, and since we despair of ever finding a perfectly rational objective in it, brings us to the point of hoping for the end only in another world. He says it would be a misunderstanding of my point of view to believe that I want this idea of a world history that is, to a certain extent, led by an a priori guiding thread to take the place of history as such, whose composition is wholly empirical. I mean, so there's like just doing normal history, but that's not really what he's talking about. This idea is only a reflection of what a philosophical mind, which must above all be well versed in history, could attempt to do from another perspective. So we drop down a few lines. He says, without doubt, they will treasure the history of the most ancient times, whose documents will have long since vanished, but they will treasure them only from the standpoint of what interests them, namely, what peoples and governments have done to contribute to or impair the objective of cosmopolitanism. So it's not just a view of history as such, which asks particular kinds of questions and reviews documents in a particular way, and has its own sort of strategy for the discipline by which we can make determinations about what's factual, what's not factual, and it's more complicated than that. But the basic idea is that you go back and you look at what exists and read it and interpret it and sort of correlate it with the other things that we know, so that you can give a certain type of account about, and here's history. Here's what happened, or at least here's what happened from this perspective or this perspective or this perspective. And you can problematize that. And so, like today, we do a lot of history from from sort of revisionist standpoint, meaning coming from various disenfranchised viewpoints. And so, in recent decades, it's much more important to a lot of historians to not sort of say, like, and here's from this objective, almost imperial-like perspective, here's what happened, but what does it look like was happening from the people, at the bottom of society, um, or who history has, largely ignored or whatever. But anyways, he's not talking about history as such. He's talking about something else, right? He's talking about a philosophical approach to this. He says, to make note of this in order to direct the ambitions of national leaders and their servants to the only means by which they can be honorably remembered, even in the most distant future, that can provide some small motivation for attempting such a philosophical history. And again, this is going back and not just saying what happened or what didn't happen or how it happened or this person in this state and this person in this state. He's saying with this cosmopolitan, aim, bringing everyone together, maximizing freedom, and all that stuff we've been talking about. How can you go back and read history to see how it is that particular societies facilitated or impaired bringing that about? To what and why? So that to sort of act as a small motivator, so that people can kind of get on board with this enlightenment train, with this cosmopolitan train, to help us get there. Can we? Granted, it's going to happen anyways from Kant's point of view, but we can make it easier on ourselves or harder on ourselves. So, saying all that, I think we've touched on everything that we needed to, and I think that this is going to be really helpful for jumping into the Hegel. That's also going to talk about a philosophical approach to history, and as I said, kind of going to build on this and maybe change some of this, but definitely is going to be a major development in philosophy and philosophy's connection to history, how it's thinking about history, which will then sort of set us up for when we get to Marx and Nietzsche and all that stuff. So, anyways, until then, you keep reading and keep thinking.